This afternoon, for our third and final panel, we are joined by Geneva Overholser, who is our moderator for this panel. Geneva is a senior fellow and consultant at the Democracy Fund. She was editor of the Des Moines Register, which led the paper to a Pulitzer Prize for public service while she was there, and has been an ombudsman of the Washington Post, a member of the editorial board of the New York Times, a syndicated columnist for the New York Post Writers Group. She serves on the boards of the American Academy of American Poets, the Rita Allen Foundation, Northwestern University in Qatar, and the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. And our panelists this afternoon, over to the right, we are joined by the Honorable Kweisi Mfume, a former member of Congress and also board member of Research America. We have with us Dr. Jean-Christophe Tellier, CEO and chairman of the Executive Committee of UCB. Dr. Robert Califf, Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Emil Kakkis, president and founder of the nonprofit Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. And Sudha Parikh, the senior vice president and managing director for DIA Global and a member of Research America's board of directors. Thank you.
Thank you. And welcome to the final panel of the afternoon. I am delighted and honored to be here. I met Mary Woolley at an event in Cambridge a few weeks ago at a convening sponsored by the Academy of American Arts and Sciences, a project that I'm co-chairing called The Public Face of Science, that fundamentally is trying to figure out how the public relates to science and how we might affect that for the better. So I've learned a great deal, and I'm grateful to be here. I must say I miss having Mary here, but as a grandmother, I'm thrilled to the choice that she made. So we have a terrific panel. We're going to be concentrating on the Food and Drug Administration largely, which has so much to do.
It's like a bullseye right here.
You're seated in the middle for a good reason, right? It has so much to do, as all of us know, with many of the things we've talked about already today. And it's facing its own challenges and opportunities, and much under discussion in that splendid dome or under it. But I would like to begin sort of to set a baseline without putting too much of a spotlight on Dr. Califf. You have been clear about your priorities, and I'm eager to hear you just sort of brief us on what you have set forth as your priorities and kind of the status of them, if you would.
Sure. So, I mean, I think as people in the room probably know, I'm a latecomer to a presidential appointment requiring confirmation, which is quite a lengthy and interesting thing to go through. But having gotten through it and having been at the FDA for about a year before starting as commissioner, I had a chance to see what was going on. And far and away, given the amazing opportunities and challenges of the upcoming science, the number one issue for me has been the workforce at the FDA. And we'll get a chance to talk more about it, but let me just use the term gene editing. I'll just let it stop there. We'll get back to it later. But if you think that you can regulate gene editing without an amazing scientific organization, you're out of your mind. And so, and yet we're in a federal system which is devised across the board for the entire federal workforce to be fair to everybody. And we've got a lot of special needs, and so that's been a tremendous effort, and we are making progress. I won't go into details in the interest of time. Issue number two for me is what I call evidence generation. And I think the easy way to think about this is we have to make decisions every day. The great thing about academia that I came from is you did a study and then you'd write a paper saying more research is needed. At the FDA, you do your research and then you have to make a decision, and a lot of people's well-being depends on a good decision, including a major part of the economy, about 20 to 25% of the whole economy. But I noticed right away that when we have really good evidence, there tends to still be arguments because there are winners and losers when you make competitive decisions or even decisions that are not competitive on the face, but change, most of what we do changes marketplaces. So there's still heated discussions, but they're relatively civil and well-informed. Then we have to make a number of decisions where we frankly just have bad data. We don't have good information. And those tend to be dominated by opinion, politics. No one is satisfied, but there are winners and losers created. And internally at the FDA, it doesn't feel right because you have less confidence in the decision that you're making. But there are decisions that we have to make in that regard. So as a country, and it relates to the part I heard of the last two discussions, if you ask me what should link healthcare and public health, in the past it was hard to link because we had human communication as the issue. We now have electronic records that pertain to the whole gamut. They're there, they're available, but we haven't made them into the information sources that we needed. So a tremendous effort both at the FDA and across the federal government to take advantage of the resources that are developing in the way of electronic health records, claims data, geospatial information systems, and linking these things together so that we can back up many of the assertions that were made, I think, correctly, and devise strategies and implement them and measure how we're doing, and then refine. So evidence generation is number two. I'll close by just saying one of the great things that happens at the FDA when you get nominated by the president, first of all, you think the president offered me a job in the Oval Office. I've got it made as you walk out. And then you realize you actually don't have a job because you can't get the job unless the Senate confirms you. And so the whole FDA goes to work and asks the question, what can we teach this idiot that would allow him to get through a Senate confirmation hearing? And it's an amazing compilation. I got 150 issues. The whole FDA comes together and puts together briefing documents on these really complex, difficult issues that are just amazing to learn about. And out of those 150, we selected 16 with the time that we have to focus on. And some of them have already been mentioned. Emerging threats to public health like infections and terrorism. The opioid epidemic is another. Precision medicine is another. I could go down the whole list, but I won't. And I'm pleased to say we're making, I think pretty good progress on all, but I do want to emphasize what I think the last two panels have said. If we don't have an emergency defense fund to support what I think is, I didn't know much about it, but the effort across federal agencies when there's a public health emergency is profound and amazing to see. But if it's not funded, you're essentially going to take away from all the things that everybody else is counting on for their routine day-to-day activity. And so we've got a real problem there that needs to be dealt with. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. At the risk of making you feel even more like more teaching for the idiot, which is not the intention, I wonder if we could go down and just each of you, starting with Dr. Parikh, give us a sense of what would you emphasize on his agenda, what would you put on it that's not on there, what would you hope wouldn't be on there, or any other response you'd like to make?
So I'm happy to do that, but I think he's heard from about 1,000 different people about what should be done. I want to take a step back and say, this is not your father's FDA. If I've been associated with this process for 20 years now, and when I first got to DC, FDA was insular. It had no science to speak of. It was not loved by anyone. In 2005, there were worries about not even having enough dollars to pay the workforce that it had. That is not the case. This is an FDA that reaches out. It's proactive. It has, Dr. Califf and his team are out at every conference I can think of, and they're proactively engaging with industry in ways that they never did before. So we've come a long, long way, a very long way, and so I think it's important to recognize that. If I think of it in terms of what would I suggest, number one, the workforce, I agree completely. The second is continue to maintain this outward face. That building over there, the Capitol, is incredibly important to the FDA. I think of the funding mechanisms for FDA. PDUFA is a wonderful thing. It's amazing. It's amazing we even came up with it. You know, it's amazing to me that we were able to come together, both parties, and come up with a way to fund the FDA that was outside the appropriations process. All that conversation we've had in the last 2 panels has been about how do you fund these things in different and extraordinary ways. PDUFA is a prime example of a success story. So I want to continue to have that external face towards Congress.
Thank you. Dr. Kakas.
Well, we work on accelerating biotechnology innovation for rare diseases, and really for the rare disease world, we're in a really golden age of new drugs being developed, and there's so many new technologies, new strategies that are coming forth with solutions to disease we didn't think could be solved. And that's creating, I think, an enormous strain for the FDA because there's so many diseases that they may have never seen before, first treatment ever being developed with technology that's novel and not well understood. And I think that's putting a particular strain on the agency and the current structure of it. And I think one of the things that, and we've talked before, is that I think that increasing specialization of the review divisions and the people that have to do this, that they have to have enough time to do the scientific background, go to the conference and be connected. And we think that's something that has to happen in order to allow the FDA to keep up with this burgeoning number of rare disease treatments that are coming forth. We have the opportunity to really change care for these patients, and I think it's important for the FDA to have the resources, not just fees, user fees, but other funding from the government to make sure we're able to meet the need and solve these diseases for patients who have no treatments currently.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Tellier.
I would like to echo what has been said before. You know, as a biopharma company, we need to strengthen our link with all of the different partners involved, and particularly in this moment where there is so many things that are changing right now. We have been in a model which was mainly sequencing, you know, moving from research to development, then to engage with the agencies to try to understand what would be the framework where our drugs can be used, and then putting them to the public, trying to reach the patients. And if you think about what it is now, it is an evolving environment. There is a lot of new opportunities that you mentioned gene editing, just for one. So the way we are doing research, the way we are able to translate this research into medications, and the way we could be able to have more precise medicine for a more well-defined group of patients requires much more than just few clinical trials. So we need to embrace the cycle, to live in a continuous way, to try to develop ability to learn and learn live, and to connect with agencies to make sure that all of these data can fuel the better knowledge of the medication so we can have a better solution for each of the patients. So all of that's required better connections. And so we need to get this openness and these communications, making sure that we are sharing the data at the very early stage and trying to better understand how we can get there.
And Representative Mfulme.
Thank you. I want to, first of all, be very supportive and commend Dr. Keller for the approach that he's making. The outreach is extremely important. And I'd like, if I could, for a minute, maybe to talk about a couple of the real practical challenges that I'm sure he knows are out there for the agency, but also for the future of the agency. The number one thing is money. I mean, I don't know how we have any argument about sustainability or progress into the future if we're not finding a way to advocate for the dollars that are needed. And that, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, is hitched to a very political environment that, you know, kind of goes with the way the wind is going every 4 years. John Porter, our chair, and Mike, who is a member of the board, and I all served in Congress together at a different time. And I'm not going to suggest that the issues were different for the FDA. I think that there is a lack of willingness to cooperate on basic fundamental things that, in this instance, deal with medical science, that has really slowed the pace and made the challenge much more difficult. And then, you know, you've got the fact that the FDA today is not what it was 110 years ago when it was founded. I mean, it's a completely different universe that it orbits in. People can organize almost instantaneously overnight if they hate something that the FDA is doing, if they want to change it. You know, so when it comes to the issue of medical therapies, you see instant groups of large advocates forming all over the place, bringing pressure on the people who make the votes and who matter in some instances, that the FDA is not doing enough. And then on the other side of that is the large population of individuals who are the detractors who says, well, wait a minute, they're just not doing what they ought to do. And some of you will recall the controversy around medical devices and the study that was completed a few years back that said most of the recalls of those devices in many instances had gotten prior approval from the FDA. And so that group is arguing that the FDA doesn't do enough. Those arguments are going to go back and forth. I think that's good. It's a healthy debate. It causes people to listen, number one, who were not paying attention at all. But there's got to be some effort, in my opinion, to be able to influence the influencers so that the issue of money becomes less of an issue. User fees are fine, but they will never pay the costs. The workforce issue is a real issue, but it really can't completely be settled until you find a way to be able to pay for the workforce and all that goes with it. And so you know, what alarms me is that you have members of the House and Senate, some of whom feel very strongly and are very supportive about the FDA going forward. And then you have others who have no idea other than what they read or heard on the news or someone said to them about what's really happening with the FDA, why it's important, why 110 years later we've got to adjust our approaches and our support and even our criticism in some instances. And then there's a whole another group who will take the oath of office in January who never had this come up on the campaign trail at all. It's not an issue, you know? So they come in not knowing less in many regards. So the advocates, I think, have to be reached in such a way that they become real advocates for the agency beyond what all of you in this room have done so many, many years in your various roles in academia, medicine, and elsewhere. And for me, I just think that's a very real practical challenge that we've got to overcome.
Well, thank you all. Dr. Califf, I know that you can't address pending legislation, so I want to stick with some key themes, although the rest of you should feel free. Themes that are prominent in the user fee and cures discussions. And they're prominent because they're top of mind for patients and researchers and others outside the research community. So one of them, obviously, is the use of real-world data to supplement, this goes back, Dr. Tellier, to some of what you were saying, supplement, and in some cases, substitute for gold standard randomized controlled clinical trials. I'd like to hear from any of you who want to talk about this. What is the greatest opportunity here, and what's the greatest challenge? And anybody who wants to jump in is welcome.
Well, let me set the pace here. Just, I think, I don't blame you for the way you posed the question. It represents the way most people talk about it, and I think it's a total misfire. But, and we have a series of writings that are about to come out about this, but there's complete agreement inside the leadership of the FDA that what we're really talking about here are two dimensions of information. One is, where does the data come from? And there's a reason there was a long tradition of doing clinical trials in a rarefied, set-aside research clinic environment because there's no way to do the trials in practice because there were no information systems in practice where you could do it. And so, you know, I call this the parallel universe, which is what you referred to as the classical gold standard randomized trial. What it really is a historical, traditional randomized clinical trial. But that rarefied research clinic environment is a source of data. It's not the method of randomization. And so you then say, well, we can now expand into clinical practice. And you know, it took me a while to catch on to this because I grew up developing therapies for heart attack. Well, you can't take a heart attack patient off to the research and say, you know, why don't you have your heart attack tomorrow? We'll make an appointment in the research clinic. They come into the emergency room, and that's where you do your clinical trials in real life. And so that's becoming more and more feasible because we have information systems in hospitals called electronic health records now. They're getting better and better, and a lot of what Joe Selby and PCORI are doing, the NIH with its collaboratory, is developing higher quality cleaned up data. But now we have this emergence that we couldn't have even talked about 5 years ago of personal devices and social media. So if you talk about problems like movement disorders, there are a lot of people who believe that the old-fashioned clinic detailed assessments are just completely the wrong way to do it. We should be measuring motion in real life, which is entirely feasible. Couldn't have been done without cloud computing, et cetera. That's all possible now. That's the source of data. The other dimension is what's your experimental method. So it's not one versus the other. And I'll just say the highest form of the art in our view is randomization within the real world. And it's happening. There are many successful examples developing. And so if you come back to us and say what should go in a label for a medical product, instructions for use, what are the risks and benefits. In the past, we've been limited by, if you do a trial in a research clinic, you don't really know. You can extrapolate, and in general, you're right. But if you do the trials in the real populations who are going to get treated and you measure the real world outcomes, then you have a profile that gives you much better information to go into the label. So that's the way we see it. This is going to be a rapidly growing area. And we think that the old-fashioned traditional clinical trial in a research setting still is going to have great value for early development, phase 2, for many things in phase 3. But we also know that, you know, the need to know beyond just getting on the market, particularly with the rare diseases where by law and appropriately, we're going to use unvalidated biomarkers and accelerated approval to put treatments on the market if there's no other treatment and it's a dire disease. We got to then fill in, and by law, we also then, the company has to prove that the clinical effect is actually there. And you know, these things need to be done where the patients are in the real world. So again, I just think it's a false dichotomy of these two things. There are two dimensions, and there's a right mix of these two dimensions for any question that you have.
Very interesting. I appreciate that, and I do want to get to open next and to orphan drugs and rare diseases. But before we get there, are there thoughts in response to this question from others on the panel? Dr. Tellier?
Yeah, no, I do appreciate very much the approach, because if you think, once again, if you think about what was the sequence of events before, we got this very well structured experimental environment in order to test what we thought was the best way to evaluate the activity of a drug. And then the drugs come to the reality, and then it was basically a safety element and a life cycle element. And I do think that the emergence of big data analytics, in a sense, and the ability to get all of the data together will help us two ways. One, it will be to get better signal earlier, in a sense that we would be able to understand better what will be the hypotheses that then we would be able to test, and downstreams being able to test them in the real environment, which will be much more powerful to some extent than what we have today. The other element is we will get also some insights of that, and hopefully we will be able to better connect the patients back to the science, being able to better understand what is the reality of the patients living with this severe disease in a long time, and the ability to better understand the impact of drugs should get us much more insights to be able to connect through genetics, through human biology, the patients back to the science, and so build new hypotheses, then can reach through signaling on early clinical development such as phase 1 and phase 2. So we should be able to get a much better sense of this virtual cycle in the future than we have in the past.
How far away is that future?
I'm an optimistic by nature, so.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, the future is here now.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you know, if you want to take care of people with cystic fibrosis as a doctor, you got to enter your data into their database, which is continuous and ongoing. And most of the patients have volunteered for their samples and data to be available to scientists, and they're looking for researchers to answer their questions, not the other way around. And, you know, I see Victor here, the National Academy of Medicine has worked out all the theory. Now we just need to implement it on a broader scale.
Did you want to say something, Dr. Priac, and then I want to go to Dr. Kakas.
Just very briefly, my thought here is that this is a case where the regulators, the patient advocates, and the industry are actually they're pretty close together, and it's just a matter of codifying it by Congress. And so if we just move, I think that's the key.
Sorry, I mispronounced your name. Parikh. Thank you.
Sure.
I was going to say one thing about real-world evidence. I think one of the things in the rare disease world is we construct these trials with these very heterogeneous patients, and they become somewhat contrived experiments where we're looking for a particular patient, a particular endpoint, and they become very narrow kind of views of what's happening. But in the real world, we're treating a wider variety of patients with different situations, and so, and the situation in the real world, the doctor, for example, giving a drug might titrate the dose and look at the safety and look at what's going on, whereas in a randomized trial, they're randomized to a dose, they're at that dose, they stick to it, and they have to stick to it for 6 months, even though in the real world, looking at the patient, they might have done something. So there's a lot of things about the two types of information that are different. And I think in the rare disease world, when we get approved, I think there has been a lot of flexibility in what we need to get approved. And if we are getting more approved on accelerated approvals with biomarkers, which I think is a good idea, then I think we definitely have to continue to follow those patients along and really collect that additional real-world data to help support what's happening. And plus, I would say in the rare disease world, the first treatment out is not going to be the end of the game. It doesn't end other development. In fact, it usually engenders more development so that as we get out there and collect real-world data, we also know what's not really working. We proved it on a particular indication, but what else is not happening in these patients? How do we fix that, and how do we go back in an iterative process? And I think that's where real-world and clinical trial data can speak to each other and help optimize what we get for rare disease patients.
I don't want to be too strident here, but we're going to have some arguments, I know, and it's fun. But
I hope so.
I mean, the fixed dose clinical trial is just one type of clinical trial.
Yeah.
There are other types, and if you look at oncology today and what's being discussed in the moonshot, it's really just what you described: iterative combinations and dose adjustment in adaptive clinical trials. So that's why I think it's so important that we talk about where does the data come from and what's the experimental design. And there are a lot of experimental designs evolving now.
There are. It's just when you don't have very many patients, it gets hard to
Fair
make
enough.
it work. That's
So
the challenge.
speaking of patients, excuse me, we have these very optimistic thoughts about patient engagement and data and precision medicine that seem very promising. But do we have a challenge in being sure that wide swaths of the population are not left out? I mean, we've seen in the past, or see now, that often happens.
Well, I think we do, and that's why I wanted to go back briefly to this gold standard of a clinical trial. I mean, the great challenge there historically has been the challenge of making sure that they are inclusive, racially, ethnically, and otherwise, so that we don't keep getting results on the end that are skewed to some extent, causing the process to start all over again. I'm not opposed to them, but I think walking into that, you've got to walk in with the sense that the demographic makeup of the population and of the process itself has to be so representative, let me say that it creates for you a better end product. I mean, it gives you data that is much more accurate.
Do you see hopes for that in the legislation now before Congress and in other steps, or?
I do. I think there are a lot of people who bring up this conversation more readily and not just assume that there are, quote, clinical trial police out there that are going to do the right thing. And so the conversation comes up on the front end. I can tell you that there has been, at least in some population groups, and I can speak for the larger African American community, after the 1934 U.S. public health situation with the injection of syphilis in a population group of men, historically there's always been a, I don't trust them, I don't believe it, I don't want to deal with it kind of attitude. So that's not predominant today, but those things cause people to pull back. And so I think on the research side, we've got to be more aggressive, not to skew the data in any wrong way, but to make sure that there is inclusiveness in the process in the attempt to have more accurate data in the end.
Do others have thoughts about that issue?
I think one of the challenges we see with getting more inclusive is that there's a lot of restrictions on what we can do to support patients' enrollment in trials, like how much we can pay them to be involved, and they have to take days off work. And what we generally find is people that are already financially at the edge can't afford to be in a trial because they can't take the day off work and we can't pay for that, and they can't afford to come in. And all those rules actually make it hard for people at the lower socioeconomic levels from actually participating. And I find that strange that we'd set up a system that to prevent the coercion of payment, but at the same time we're actually putting a significant financial burden on patients to participate in trials that we do that involve a lot of visits, a lot of coming downtown, a lot of days off work, and we don't compensate them for that. I think there's some rules need to be changed there so they're not having to sacrifice so much in a way that's really not feasible for them.
Is there any potential for changing those rules?
Well, we can, for example, pay for someone's lost wages. But that's a big deal for people who are living moment to moment.
But we can't also assume that most of the people in that group are working minimal jobs. Many are unemployment. I mean, there's vast unemployment. And so for those individuals to participate, it's actually a plus because they're being reached, they qualify, and they're being paid. So I do hear what you're saying about large numbers of people at the lower end, if I can use your term, of the socioeconomic scale that have jobs who can't afford to take time off. But I would probably suggest for every one of them, there are 5 others who aren't working at all, who in fact could be a part of a clinical trial if they met every other test. We just have to, I think, look differently while at the same time pushing your argument, because it's a legitimate argument, that if you want us to go do this, at least give us the resources to be able to compensate people, which gets back to this whole money issue again that the FDA faces. So.
I think if you look at the NIH numbers now, they've essentially fixed it by requiring that people have representative trials, and people have figured out how to do it. But most of those are not dealing with the rare diseases where you have to look at each patient one at a time as opposed to larger populations of patients. And my hope at the FDA is that we will have a standard segment of clinical trial protocols is at least a rationale for the approach to inclusiveness. Remembering that, I hate to have to say this, but we're only 4% of the world's population, so in a global medical products development market, the exact dynamics inside the US are not the only thing that companies are dealing with, and we don't have command and control like the NIH has when it gives out a grant. It says, you have a set of rules you need to adhere by, but we're working on methods to improve inclusiveness in industry-funded trials. Just as a way to illustrate how complicated this can get, simple things like we think about Hispanic and ethnicity as a key factor, but when you say Hispanic in a global trial, the Europeans are scratching their heads like, what are you talking about? This is just an American issue, not an issue for the rest of us. So it's not simple, but it's a definite issue that we need to deal with.
Can we talk for a moment about making the best use of the breakthrough designation program, or more broadly, how to speed solutions for unmet medical needs? Is that something, Dr. Tellier, you would say something about?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's a it's a very important opportunity because it's if you link that to the result and if you link that to the value, the breakthrough initiative have a very noble objective, which is making sure that we can provide at earlier stage a solution for patients that today have no solutions at all. So I do think that from that extent, this is a very important priority that we need to focus on. It's relatively unfair in a sense to think that we need to get a perfect set of data to look at a very long term if the patients today have no other solutions. Now the key question is how to continue to engage this dialogue to make sure that when we get access to this opportunity, we can evolve and learn as much as we are doing in order to making sure that we do not, in a sense, trade off quality versus time or speed. I think it's very important. I think once again, the availability of the data, the quality of the data that are today are open, create much more opportunity to get a very good and strong signal at the earlier stage that can allow us to engage the dialogue earlier and to get this process faster. It doesn't mean that then we cannot do anything after that. We need to continue to make sure that we are providing data to fine-tune and narrow the corridor of uncertainty of risk moving forward. But understanding the trade-off and the balance between the risk and the need, which some of the diseases are critical for, versus what we can afford and when, is a very important element there.
Dr. Parikh, did you want to add anything to that?
I think that lays out the points very well. My only comment is that this, just like real-world evidence, goes back to risk-benefit, and this is always the conundrum with FDA, and doing that in the right way.
I think the Breakthrough Therapy Program has been really enormously successful, and I think particularly in cancer, where there's been a lot of, where the breakthroughs get pushed and the all-hands-deck effort at FDA then moves things forward and gets things happening. And the company I'm with got a designation recently for X-linked hypophosphatemia, a rare bone disease. And the good thing about that is that it's a devastating disease, but not life-threatening. And yet, I think it was, applaud the FDA for recognizing it's still a terrible disease, and the treatment mechanism, was a breakthrough strategy, and it's having important effects in those patients. And we think that kind of view, let's accelerate and get on these cases of things that are actually going to really change health in a big way, is a great step forward. I think it's worked really well.
Three very quick points on this. Number one, we have to realize that if something moves to the top of the stack, something else is not going to get done. I used to have a mentor where the fellows knew that he only read what was on top of his pile on his desk, so we'd see who could stay the latest to put our stuff on the top. Because we do have fixed resources, that's a fact. And then, it also emphasizes the need for really smart people at the FDA, because the decision on whether you get to be breakthrough is a subjective decision, as you just pointed out. And I think the decision-making process at the FDA is the fact that people, aren't absolutely screaming all the time, is that because it's so important, it's good evidence that we're doing a pretty good job with it, and that it's a good process. But I'd also emphasize again, it's critical that people realize that even today, with all of the hype about how great we are at targeted therapies, over 90% of drugs that get into phase 1 don't make it to market because they're either not effective, or they're unknown toxicities, or there's a problem with manufacturing that can't be fixed. So when we rush, we are taking a greater risk that one of those ones that would cause harm gets there, and we've got to have a system throughout the continuity to measure that. It's a point everybody's made. So
you promised that we'd talk about gene therapies. We have about 2 minutes left. That's really adequate for gene therapy, isn't it? Can we at least address it to the extent that we can talk about whether the existing regulatory regime is robust enough, or whatever aspect any one of you might pick up, and then we need to move to questions. Sorry to make it so brief.
Well, just to make a quick point, and I'm deeply immersed in this now because it's moving so fast. And we haven't talked at all about food, but remember, that's a very large part of the FDA, and you depend on it every day. Believe me, the food you eat is safe because of FSMA and the system that's been built. But just like you can change genome in a human, where there's been a lot of talk, it is a simple thing to change a base pair, delete, add to, or substitute. You can do either of those three. A high school student can do it now in a science fair. And so how are we going to deal with that? The amazing opportunity in food is, if you think about the inefficiency, the low quality food that tends to dominate now, we can reverse that. It's within sight that you can add the most nutritious things to food genetically, I think fairly easily in the future. But that brings up all sorts of issues that regulators and society are going to need to grapple with. Then let's go to animals. Scientists, have been dealing with, how many cancers have been cured in laboratory mice and rats? But now you begin to be able to create animal models of human disease, actually by inserting parts of the human genome that create the attribute that you're interested in, so you can directly develop therapies. This is going to be huge for rare diseases, as you well know. But beyond that, let's say you like really lean beef. You can create a whole herd of cattle that are very lean pretty easily. And with the driver sequence now, you can do it so it shows up in all the progeny. That brings up whole issues about, can we get rid of entire groups of mosquitoes? You talked about that earlier today. And if you did, what would be the ecological effects? And then you go to human disease. You know, we're talking about sickle cell disease. What if you could just replace the devious mutation? You could do away with this horrible thing that happens with pain crises and problems that people with sickle cell have. But we don't really know right now how to measure off-target effects when we go to change a human genome. So that's the quick run-through of what I've been learning in the last few. Does that give you a little to think about?
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, it does. And we are now ready to start the Q&A. Please wait for a microphone to come your way. How about right here?
Well, I'd love to follow up on that topic, but I don't think there's time. So let me come back to real-world evidence. I think it's a useful distinction to talk about, and thank you for talking about where the evidence comes from as opposed to how the study is designed. But that leaves an important part of the question unanswered by this panel. So we've heard, yes, controlled trials done in a more real clinical setting, that's highly desirable. What the advocates of real-world evidence, though, often are talking about is the ability to use other than controlled trials based on large electronic databases with new technologies for propensity scoring and adjusting and the like, to draw conclusions in lieu of clinical trials. And, you know, the FDA always has accepted data, you know, spontaneous reporting of adverse events and whatever. I wonder, you know, and this isn't just for Rob, I don't want to just put Rob on the spot. What's the thinking about, are there opportunities to move beyond spontaneous reporting into more meaty areas, given how many questions we face and how limited resources are, patient resources and costs and whatever Rob's been a great pioneer of addressing some of those issues and of doing clinical trials in the setting. But is there a space for studies other than randomized trials to really start addressing more of the serious questions we need to answer?
Panel?
Short answer is yes. Yeah. And in fact, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention devices. By the way, some people know it, but Jay and I used to be on the other side of the fence with each other arguing when I was working in the early days of heart attack treatment. He was at the FDA and we had many interesting arguments. But the short answer is yes. If you look at devices, many devices are approved based on a registry. And if you look at cancer today, where there are a record number of approvals, a very high percentage now are based on single-arm trials. As a cardiologist, I don't think of these as trials. I think of them as registries, because trial to me should have a pre-specified control group that's measurable. But we are there, but we don't know where the boundaries are. So it'd be great to hear the other panelists hear what you think.
Quick responses from others. Dr. Tellier.
No, I fully agree. I mean, maybe two additional comments on Jay's questions. The first one is, I also do think that there is a tremendous value about sharing more data than what we have today. I mean, today we are thinking sometimes in silos, and some of the previous panels mentions the opportunity of sharing much more data in order to get access real life to a lot of different things and understanding who owns what. I do think that there are data available right now. I mean, in some European countries, I was in Sweden last week, for example, and if you ask the Karolinska Institute, they have completely changed the way they are managing their data and understanding longitudinally. You have here a source of observation that you can have real life quickly. So I do think that the ability to understand how we can leverage data from each other, put that together, because in the end, what's created the value is the question that you are asking, is the ability to build link and dots and not necessarily just to get the data.
I think it's an evolving answer, right? So we're still learning what is possible, and these systems are changing. They're changing from 2 years ago to today to what they'll be 2 years from now. And so it's hard to give a hard, fast yes or no At least you said preliminarily yes, but I think it'd be disingenuous to say yes or no specifically. My concern, though, is the quality of this conversation is very high. When I get to the quality of the conversation in the Capitol building, it's very low.
You said that, I didn't.
I did, that's right. And you know, to give you an example of this, you brought up this animal-human hybrid thing. Let me have one little anecdote here. I used to work in the Senate on the Appropriations Committee, and there was an amendment on the floor of the Senate to ban animal-human hybrids. This is in 2002. And I was called to the floor to go talk to somebody who was on the side of not banning this. And I talked about recombinant DNA, talked about gene editing, I talked about whatever I could think of. He said, "That's great, tell me something I can understand." And so I said, well, it bans the use of a reproductive test where you put a human sperm with a hamster egg. And I was really excited. I was 2 weeks into the job. I thought, this is great. I'm advising the Senate. And the question I got back was, what's a hamster? So,
Nice one.
this is where the quality of things is. So.
Yeah.
On that note, we must take another question. There's
think we
one
better start
over
with one
here.
question.
Can we get a mic? We have.
But he didn't say what's an egg, so this
He knew that.
could have been worse.
One of the smart ones.
Yes, please.
Well, thank you for a great panel. I'm Cindy Pellegrini with the March of Dimes, and one of the issues that we are hearing a lot more about in our community is the fact that while we have made a great deal of progress in the last decade or more in broadening research to include people of all ages, men, women, people of color, children, the one group that we still systematically, methodically exclude generally from research is pregnant women. And there's a growing sense that perhaps we're doing a disservice because these women are taking medication and they do use devices, but we aren't increasing our knowledge in that process. So could you share a few thoughts about how we might move toward the appropriate ethical inclusion of pregnant women in some clinical trials?
Interesting.
I can.
Yes.
I mean, we have a very concrete example of that, and actually it's a very good example also of dialogue and openness with the FDA. We have currently 2 clinical trials running right now on pregnant women with very specific questions on testing if the usage of one of our products will have an impact on the babies, and trying to get these answers. And we've been able to do that because we realized first, in some of our products were used in pregnant women, we get the data, then we came to the FDA with this data, and then we agreed on what should be done, and we are doing that. I think it's a very fair question. I think it's not an answer to say no or to say it's not possible, because in a sense we leave the reality into a vacuum, which is even worse than what we will do. So I'm strongly supportive of trying to do well, here also it can be done if we have the patient engagements. So for example, it's much more difficult to recruit these patients, and we need to accept that and to understand that. It should be an act where the patients understand the reality of what's going on, and it's fair to say at the end of the day, I don't want to take that risk. But we need to provide an opportunity to better understand what's going on during pregnancy, and women of childbearing age in particular is one of the populations that have been left behind, and it's really unfair.
I'm really, thank you for bringing that up. And you may know Senator Murray has a particular interest in this. I would urge you to speak to her right about now. Because if you, just to put this in perspective, there was a great effort at FDA to fix the labeling related to pregnancy. And it was a tremendous effort, and we have a beautiful way to label drugs for pregnancy. But it's like a scientist who writes a paper. There's a beautiful shell for table 1, but there's no data to go into it. People are not doing the studies, and the reticence is understandable. We have to fix it. Just to get personal, I have a daughter with congenital heart disease. There are tens of thousands of women who were not alive in previous generations who are now because of treatment. Genetic disease is going to be another example. And we don't know how to treat them. The drug labels, I'll say, don't use in pregnancy because they haven't been tested. And so doctors are having to use the treatment with no evidence, which is the way children were until recently.
We
wish
had
we-
one case. Is there one example? I worked on a disease called PKU, phenylketonuria, in which there's high blood phenylalanine levels. And maternal PKU happens when the mother has PKU and has a baby, and that affects the baby. And we came across this with a drug called sapropterin or Kuvan that was used to lower that blood level. And the problem was, of course, is that while we had our safety data, et cetera, that there was a concern that we hadn't proven that it was safe for a pregnant woman, but PKU itself was dangerous and proven dangerous in the child. And in that discussion with the FDA, what came out, which is unusual, is that the label does include the teratogenic effects of the disease in the drug label, to at least so that doctors are seeing the comparison of those two things. And we committed to following women afterward to do that. But I think in a situation where even a small decrease in phenylalanine had a big impact on maternal PKU symptoms in the baby. So it was quite important. And we think, the FDA there kind of worked with us in coming up with a label that would at least help inform doctors to make a decision between a disease that caused your baby a problem and whatever the risks are of this drug.
I'm afraid we have to wrap up now, but I want to thank each of you for just a terrific panel. Please join me.